April 28th, 1531. A crowd assembled at Smithfield, their breath clouding in the cold air, drawn by the grim spectacle unfolding before them. A man, condemned not by conventional means, but to suffer an agonizing, prolonged death in a cauldron of boiling water. Richard Roose, a cook in the service of the Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher, stood accused of a heinous act, a crime so unsettling it defied the traditional bounds of legal retribution, compelling a king to invent a punishment as barbaric as it was unprecedented. The collective silence of the witnesses was a heavy shroud, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire beneath the vast pot and the occasional murmur of morbid curiosity or profound dread. This was not a swift gallows or the clean blow of an axe. This was a protracted torment, designed to broadcast a chilling message across the realm, a lesson etched in the searing agony of a human life slowly extinguished, every scream an echo of the crown's unyielding authority. The air grew thick with a palpable tension, a blend of revulsion and awe, as the first tendrils of steam rose, foreshadowing the devastating ordeal about to commence. It was a moment that would forever stain the tapestry of English justice, a stark testament to the lengths a fearful monarchy would go to assert its dominion. We must remember this chilling ceremony of state violence. To understand why such an appalling fate was decreed for Richard Roose, one must delve into the anxieties gripping the court of King Henry VIII during a period of profound instability and paranoia. The alleged crime was the poisoning of various individuals associated with the Bishop of Rochester's household, including two of the bishop's servants. In an era where food was often prepared in communal kitchens and security was less stringent than modern standards, the idea of poison was a particularly insidious threat, striking at the heart of domestic trust and the very safety of the powerful. There was no clear motive immediately presented for Roose's actions, and the evidence against him, by contemporary legal standards, was largely circumstantial and obtained under duress. Yet the king, increasingly isolated by his desperate pursuit of a divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his burgeoning break with Rome, perceived such acts as direct affronts, not merely to individuals, but to the stability of his own regime. The fear of regicide, of covert plots and hidden enemies, haunted the corridors of power, transforming even a suspected domestic poisoning into a matter of national security, a threat to the monarch's very existence. The existing legal framework, accustomed to overt acts of treason or felony, struggled to accommodate such a nebulous yet deeply terrifying offense, driving the king towards a terrifying innovation in penal jurisprudence. This was not an anomaly, it was a reflection of a crown consumed by suspicion. Historically, England's legal system had developed a repertoire of brutal punishments for crimes deemed to threaten the social or political order, from hanging, drawing, and quartering for treason to burning at the stake for heresy. These practices, though undeniably cruel, typically followed established procedures, however summary they might seem today. But boiling alive was an entirely different category of brutality, lacking any clear precedent within English common law. While some sporadic instances of boiling as punishment existed on the continent, particularly for poisoners, it was never a recognized part of English jurisprudence. This novel application of extreme torment underscored Henry VIII's willingness to bypass traditional legal norms and forge new, terrifying precedents to consolidate his authority and quell any perceived challenge. The act of boiling, a form of public execution that guaranteed a protracted and agonizing death, was specifically chosen for its unique capacity to inflict maximum suffering and deterrence. It transcended mere punishment. It was a visceral demonstration of unchecked power, a public theater of pain designed to instill an unparalleled fear in the hearts of the populace. The very novelty of the method made it more horrific, transforming a human being into an object lesson, a symbol of the king's absolute and devastating reach. The decision to inflict such a devastating punishment lay squarely at the feet of King Henry VIII, a monarch whose personality was increasingly defined by his tyrannical tendencies and an insatiable need for absolute control. Consumed by the great matter of his divorce and the subsequent break with Rome, Henry saw treachery and disloyalty everywhere. The alleged poisoning incident, whether Roose acted alone or was merely a pawn, tapped into the king's deepest fears about his own safety and the loyalty of his subjects. He personally pushed for the implementation of this unprecedented sentence, transforming it into law via an act of parliament shortly after Roose's execution. This was not justice in the traditional sense, but a deliberate act of state terror, a performative display of power designed to send an unequivocal message. Any act, however seemingly minor, that threatened the king or his perceived allies would be met with swift, brutal, and hauntingly creative retribution. The public spectacle at Smithfield was carefully orchestrated to maximize its impact, transforming the condemned man's death into a living warning, a chilling illustration of what awaited those who dared to transgress the increasingly narrow boundaries of royal favor or perceived loyalty. The crowd were compelled to witness this horrific demonstration. But to grasp the full weight of this moment, one must consider Richard Roose himself, not merely as an accused, but as a human being caught in the inexorable gears of state power. While the specifics of his background are scarce, he was a humble cook, a servant, standing in stark contrast to the mighty monarch who decreed his end. He was not a nobleman, a political rival, or a religious dissenter whose actions might be understood within a broader ideological conflict. He was an ordinary man, accused of a crime that inflamed royal paranoia, transformed into a sacrifice on the altar of state security. His vulnerability was profound, his voice likely unheard amidst the clamor for retribution. The question of his guilt remains debated by historians. Some suggest he may have been manipulated, or even entirely innocent, a convenient scapegoat in a climate of fear. Regardless of his true culpability, his individual identity was subsumed by the symbolic role he was forced to play, a living embodiment of the crown's terrible majesty and its capacity for brutality. His individual agony was transmuted into a collective lesson, a haunting reminder that in Henry VIII's England, even the lowest servant could become a victim of the king's unbridled power, leaving behind a legacy of torment. The execution itself transcended the bounds of human comprehension. Richard Roose was placed into a large cauldron of water, positioned over a roaring fire, a medieval cauldron of suffering constructed specifically for this ceremony. The process was deliberate, calculated to maximize the agonizing duration of his death. As the water slowly heated, his initial screams were those of shock and pain, evolving into shrieks of unbearable anguish as his flesh began to scald and blister. Eyewitness accounts, though sparse and often filtered through the lens of historical memory, convey the truly devastating nature of the spectacle. Roose reportedly cried out piteously, pleading for mercy, his pleas growing weaker as his body succumbed to the inferno. The stench of burning flesh and the sounds of his suffering filled the air, a ghastly assault on the senses of all who gathered. This was no swift demise. It was an extended public torture, a slow dissolution of a human life. The sheer brutality of the act aimed to terrorize, to ensure that the message embedded in Roose's protracted torment would never be forgotten. It was a haunting display of state power, designed to leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness, a truly unforgettable and tragic sacrifice. The public reaction to Richard Roose's devastating execution was complex and varied, reflecting the nuanced fears and beliefs of the age. While some in the crowd may have seen it as a necessary act of justice, a deterrent against the insidious threat of poisoning, others were undoubtedly horrified by the sheer brutality of the spectacle. The very novelty of the punishment likely amplified its psychological impact, leaving a haunting impression on those who witnessed it. Accounts suggest that some onlookers fainted, unable to bear the sight and sound of the man's protracted agony. This was not a moment of moral consensus or universal affirmation of royal justice. Rather, it exposed a deep fissure in the public's understanding of legitimate state power. The public's complicity, simply by being present as witnesses, underscores the chilling nature of power exercised through terror. The moral inversion inherent in Roose's execution was stark. An act intended to restore order and demonstrate justice, instead revealed the inherent barbarity that lay beneath the surface of the state. The system meant to protect them had become their executioner, demonstrating that even those who believed in the king's authority could not escape the discomfort of witnessing such extreme and arbitrary cruelty. In the immediate aftermath of Richard Roose's death, the political and legal machinery of Henry VIII's England moved swiftly to formalize the extraordinary punishment. A statute, commonly known as the Poisoning Act of 1531, 22 Henry VIII c. 12, was passed by Parliament, specifically making it treason to poison and prescribing death by boiling as the punishment for such an offense. This legislative act served to retrospectively legitimize Roose's execution, transforming a shocking, unprecedented act into a legal precedent. However, the very specific and devastating nature of the punishment boiling alive was rarely, if ever, inflicted again in England, suggesting that even in an age of severe penalties, its brutality perhaps proved too extreme, even for the architects of terror. The act itself remained on the statute books for some time, a haunting testament to a king's paranoia and his willingness to forge new laws to meet perceived threats, however disproportionate the response. The quick legislative codification highlights the king's desire not just to punish, but to establish a legal framework for extreme torment, embedding the memory of Roose's sacrifice within the very fabric of English law, a constant reminder of the limits of dissent. The enduring legacy of Richard Roose's execution stretches far beyond the immediate shockwaves it sent through Henry VIII's England. It serves as a stark historical marker, a chilling example of the intersection between political paranoia, the fragility of individual rights, and the terrifying capacity of the state for brutality. His death became a haunting footnote in legal history, a rare and extreme instance of cruel and unusual punishment, centuries before such concepts were formalized. It speaks volumes about the absolute power wielded by a monarch like Henry VIII, who could, on a whim, redefine justice and inflict unimaginable torment to secure his authority. The story of Roose is not just a tale of a single devastating execution. It is a broader narrative about the weaponization of fear, the arbitrary nature of power, and the profound sacrifice of an individual caught in the crucible of historical change. His forgotten name echoes through the centuries as a silent witness to the darkest impulses of unchecked authority, a grim reminder of the price paid when systems meant to protect become instruments of state violence. We must remember Richard Roose not for any alleged crime, but for the devastating manner of his death. His execution by boiling stands as a potent symbol of judicial cruelty, a stark historical ceremony of state power unbound. It was not justice in any recognizable sense, but a warning, a public declaration of the lengths to which a regime consumed by fear and obsessed with control would go to secure its dominion. The memory of his torment at Smithfield that day in April serves as a haunting reminder of the fragility of human dignity when confronted by institutional brutality. It forces us to reflect on the nature of punishment, the dangers of arbitrary power, and the ethical responsibility of a society to protect even the most vulnerable of its members from such sacrifice. Roose's story, though often overlooked, continues to resonate, urging us to recognize the chilling echoes of unchecked authority in our own times, and to perpetually question the systems meant to protect us, lest they become our executioners. His screams, though silenced centuries ago, still speak to the terrifying cost of fear.